They didn't know my name. They never thought they'd need to. When I walked into that conference room on a Tuesday morning in November, my heels clicking against the marble floor, my portfolio under my arm, I could see them sitting at the far end of the table. My former mother-in-law in her ivory blazer, my former father-in-law with his reading glasses perched low on his nose. They looked older, smaller somehow, and they had absolutely no idea who I was. Their lawyer stood up first. He extended his hand and said, "Good morning, Ms. Hartley. Thank you for making time for us today." I shook his hand, took my seat at the head of the table, and watched my former father-in-law smile the polished, desperate smile of a man who needed something from me. I had seen that smile before, just never directed at me. "We appreciate the opportunity," he said. I opened my portfolio slowly and said, "Let's get started." I had waited 11 years for a morning exactly like this one. I was 22 when I married my husband. His name was Daniel, and he was the kind of man who laughed too loud in quiet restaurants and left notes on the bathroom mirror when he knew I had an early shift. We met at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital where I worked as an administrative coordinator. He spilled red wine on my sleeve and spent the rest of the evening apologizing in increasingly creative ways. By midnight, I had forgiven him. By the following spring, I had married him. His family had money, old money, the kind that had been in the same county for 3 generations and liked everyone to know it. His father ran a regional commercial real estate development firm that his own father had built from a single strip mall in 1971. His mother sat on the boards of 2 charitable foundations and chaired the annual hospital gala every October. They were exactly what you would picture when someone said established Southern family, all sweet tea on the veranda and firm handshakes and opinions delivered with a smile so polite it almost disguised the sharpness underneath. They were never warm to me. I understood that. I was not from their world. My mother had raised me alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Raleigh after my father left when I was 9. I had paid my own way through community college and then through my degree at UNC Wilmington. I did not have a family name that opened doors. I had a work ethic and a stubbornness that my mother always called a gift and my in-laws called something else entirely. They tolerated me because Daniel loved me. And Daniel loved me completely, without conditions, the way people love when they are not afraid of what love costs. We had 3 years together. They were the best years of my life, and then they were over. He was driving home from a job site on a Thursday evening in March. A truck ran a red light at an intersection just 4 miles from our house. The paramedics told me he likely never felt a thing. I held on to that for a long time because I did not have much else to hold on to. The grief was enormous, but what came after the grief was something I had not prepared for. My in-laws arrived at our house 2 weeks after the funeral. My father-in-law sat across from me at the kitchen table where Daniel and I had eaten breakfast every morning, and he explained, calmly and with the manner of someone who had rehearsed this speech, that the house was technically owned by the family trust. He explained that Daniel's share of the business would revert to the surviving partners. He explained that they had spoken with their attorney and that my rights, as a spouse of only 3 years with no children and no formal ownership stake in any of the family assets, were limited. My mother-in-law sat beside him and said nothing. She looked at a point just past my shoulder the entire time, as if making eye contact would cost her something she wasn't willing to spend. "We think it would be best," my father-in-law said, "if you found other arrangements. We'll give you 30 days. I remember the silence after he finished talking. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming. I remember thinking that Daniel's coffee mug was still in the dish rack because I had not been able to put it away. "He was my husband," I said. My father-in-law folded his hands on the table. "And he was our son. We need to handle his affairs in a way that protects what he built." I left with my clothes, my car, a box of photographs, and $3,000 in a personal savings account that had nothing to do with any family trust. I did not cry in front of them. I saved that for the parking lot of a Walgreens 2 miles away, where I sat in my car for 40 minutes before I was capable of driving. I moved into a studio apartment in downtown Wilmington that cost me $650 a month. I went back to work at the hospital the following week because sitting still felt like drowning. My coworkers were kind in the way people are when they don't know what to say. Gentle, slightly careful, always a half step away from the full weight of what had happened. I appreciated their kindness, and I understood their distance, and I went home every night to an apartment that still smelled faintly like fresh paint and nothing like home. The person who changed everything was not a family member. He was not a romantic partner. He was a 63-year-old commercial real estate broker named Mr. Caldwell, who had been Daniel's mentor for nearly a decade and who showed up at my apartment 4 months after Daniel died with a casserole dish and a business proposition. He sat in my one good chair and told me that Daniel had talked about me constantly. He told me that Daniel had said I was the sharpest person he knew and that it was a waste I wasn't in real estate. He told me he had a junior associate position open in his independent brokerage and that he thought I should take it. I don't have a license, I said. That's what courses are for, he said. You have time? I have nothing but time, I said. I got my license in 5 months. I worked at his brokerage and I studied everything he put in front of me. He was a demanding teacher, the kind who didn't soften feedback but delivered it without cruelty. And I discovered that I was genuinely good at this work. I had a memory for numbers and a patience for negotiation, and something my clients eventually started calling a talent for finding value in places other people had stopped looking. Mr. Caldwell taught me that real estate was not about buildings. It was about understanding what people needed and what they were afraid of, and that if you could sit across a table from someone and genuinely comprehend both of those things, you could find a deal. I thought about my former in-laws often during those years. I thought about what they needed and what they were afraid of. I found it useful to understand. I got my broker's license. I started handling my own clients. By the time I was 28, I was running a modest independent operation. By 30, I had 2 employees and a reputation in the Wilmington market for commercial acquisitions. By 32, I had partnered with a developer out of Charlotte on a mixed-use project that returned better than anyone had projected and opened doors I had not known existed. I changed my name back to my maiden name, Hartley, a year after Daniel died. It had not felt like an erasure of him. It had felt like a reclamation of myself. I carried my grief privately, visited his grave on his birthday and on the day we were married, and I kept his photograph on my desk, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what it looked like when someone believed in you without reservation. Mr. Day, Caldwell, had a heart attack on a Wednesday morning when I was 31. He survived, but only barely, and the recovery aged him visibly. He retired the following year and moved to be near his daughter in Savannah. At his retirement dinner, he gave a short speech in which he talked about the people who had made him proud over 40 years in the business. And he spent more time talking about me than anyone else. I held it together until I got to the parking lot. He called me on my birthday every year without fail. He was the first person I told when I closed my biggest deal. He told me Daniel would have been insufferably proud of me, and I told him he was probably right, and we both laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that had grief folded into it. The deal that changed my trajectory was a distressed portfolio acquisition in the spring of the year I turned 33. A pension fund in Ohio was liquidating a collection of underperforming commercial properties across the Southeast, and through a contact I had cultivated at a regional bank, I got access to the data room early. I spent 3 weeks doing nothing else, sleeping 4 hours a night, living on diner coffee and takeout containers I kept forgetting to throw away. I found something in the numbers that the fund's own analyst had missed. A cluster of properties in 2 secondary markets that had been undervalued because of outdated comp data. I structured a purchase offer with a financing partner I had been building a relationship with for 2 years, and we closed the acquisition at a price that made the pension fund happy and left us with a position worth considerably more. The story ran in a regional business journal. It was the first time my name had been in print in a professional context. I read it 3 times, sitting in my car in the parking deck of my office building, and then I sent the link to Mr. Caldwell, who texted back a string of exclamation points that made me smile for the rest of the day. I was not a celebrity. I was not nationally known. But in the commercial real estate world in the Carolinas, people had started to know who I was, and more importantly, people had started to trust what I thought. The first time I heard that my former in-laws were in trouble, I was at lunch with a colleague who moved in circles that occasionally overlapped with old money in the Cape Fear region. He mentioned it the way people mention things they don't realize are personal, casually without weight, as a piece of interesting market gossip. The development firm had overextended. A large mixed-use project on the coast had gone significantly over budget, and the original financing structure had depended on a pre-sale velocity that never materialized. They had refinanced twice. The second refinancing had terms that were becoming difficult to service. There was talk, my colleague said, of bringing in outside capital or possibly exploring a sale of certain assets. I listened and kept my expression neutral and said something non-committal about the coastal market being unforgiving right now. I thought about it for 2 days. I called Mr. Capina, called well and talked around it without saying exactly what I was thinking, and he, who had known me for 11 years and was not easily confused, listened to the whole thing and then said, "Do you want to pursue it?" "I don't know," I said. "That's not true," he said. "You called me." He was right. I called him because I had already decided and I needed someone I trusted to tell me it wasn't insane. "It's a legitimate opportunity," I said. "The underlying assets have value. The problem is the capital structure, not the properties." "That's the business answer," Mr. Caldwell said. "What's the other answer?" I was quiet for a moment. "I want to do it right," I said finally. "Not to hurt them. Just to do it on my terms. Walk in on my terms." "Then do it on your terms," he said. My financing partner and I put together a proposal over the following 6 weeks. It was a clean offer, a structured acquisition of the distressed assets at fair market value, with an option for my former in-laws' firm to retain a minority operational stake in a newly formed entity. The terms were not punitive. I had specifically ensured they were not punitive, because I did not want this to be a punishment. I wanted it to be a transaction. I wanted to sit across a table from people who had looked through me like I was furniture and have them look at me as a counterparty. My attorney submitted the proposal under my company name, Hartley Partners. My first name did not appear in the initial documentation. By the time the meeting was scheduled, their attorney had done some preliminary research, but had focused primarily on our deal history and financials, not on personal background. My former in-laws were not the type to cross-reference a maiden name. They had never thought of me as someone worth tracking. I dressed carefully the morning of the meeting, not expensively, practically. A navy blazer, a good watch that had been a gift to myself on the day I closed the Ohio acquisition, low heels. Professional. Competent. Unambiguous. I arrived 3 minutes before the scheduled time and was in my seat when they came in. I recognized them immediately. 11 years had softened the edges of their faces and sharpened something around the eyes. My former mother-in-law's hair had gone entirely silver. My former father-in-law moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees had started negotiating with the rest of his body. They did not recognize me. Not at first. Their attorney introduced them and then gestured to me and said, "And this is Missy Hartley, managing principal at Hartley Partners." I stood and extended my hand first to their attorney, then to my former father-in-law, then to my former mother-in-law. Her hand was cool and light in mine, and when she shook it, she looked at me with the practiced pleasantness of someone who had done 10,000 handshakes at charitable functions, and there was nothing behind her eyes that recognized me at all. "Thank you for meeting with us, Ms. Hartley," my former father-in-law said. "We've looked over your firm's history, and we're quite impressed." I said, "I appreciate that. Let's walk through the structure." I had been in enough negotiations to know how to hold a room. I had learned it from Mr. Notifications to know how to hold a room. I had learned it from Mr. Caldwell, who had learned it from 40 years of sitting across tables from people who were afraid of what they might lose. You don't rush. You let the silence do work. You ask questions when you already know the answers because the way people answer questions tells you more than the answers themselves do. My former father-in-law was a good businessman. I had always known that. He asked sharp questions about the financing terms and the operational management structure. I answered each one directly. I watched him slowly relax as the meeting progressed, the way people relax when they start to believe a deal is going to save them. It was about 40 minutes in, near the end of the financial review, that my former mother-in-law looked at me with slightly more focus than she had before. I saw something shift in her expression. A small thing. A tightening around the eyes. She looked at my hands for a moment. I was not wearing Daniel's ring. I had not worn it in 9 years. But something, maybe the way I paused, or a gesture, some ghost of familiarity that the body remembers even when the mind has filed it away, made her look at me differently. She leaned forward slightly and said, "I'm sorry, this is a strange question, but have we met before? You look very familiar to me." The room was quiet. I set down my pen and I looked at her directly and I said, quietly, "We have, a long time ago." She stared at me. And then I watched it happen, watched the pieces settle into place, watched 11 years collapse into one expression. Her face changed entirely. "My God," she said. My former father-in-law looked between us. "Margaret, do you know each other?" She didn't answer him immediately. She kept looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before and would not have been able to name easily, somewhere between recognition and something that looked, unexpectedly, like pain. "This is Daniel's wife," she said. Her voice was different, smaller. "This is your Claire." "Claire Hartley," I said. I went back to my maiden name after Daniel passed. The silence in that room was unlike any silence I had sat in during a business meeting. My former father-in-law set down his own pen and looked at the table and then looked at me, and I watched the geography of his face rearrange itself around a weight he had not walked in with. Their attorney looked between all three of us with the careful expression of a professional who has learned not to react to things he doesn't yet understand. I did not move to fill the silence. I had not come to this room to perform anything. I had come to make a decision about a business transaction, and I would make that decision on exactly the terms I had outlined, and whatever happened in the space between the business and the history was something that would simply have to be navigated honestly. Finally, my former father-in-law said, "Claire." He said my name the way people say something they have not said aloud in a very long time and are surprised to find still in their mouth. "We didn't know." "I know," I said. "How long have you been doing this?" "The firm, about 8 years," I said. He nodded slowly. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the table and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and in that gesture he looked, for the first time, simply old and tired and human. My former mother-in-law was still looking at me. Her eyes were bright in a way that I recognized and did not particularly want to have feelings about, so I focused on keeping my voice steady when I spoke next. "I want to be straightforward with you about something," I said. "The proposal in front of you is what it is because it makes financial sense, not because of our history. The terms are fair. I've had my attorney review them specifically to make sure they are not favorable to us beyond what the market would bear. If you choose to move forward, it will be a legitimate transaction and I will conduct it professionally. If you choose not to move forward because of who I am, I will understand that completely, and there will be no hard feelings." My former father-in-law looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You're not angry." It was not exactly a question. I said, "for a long time. But anger is expensive and I needed the capital for other things." Something moved across his face that I might, if I were feeling generous, have called remorse. My former mother-in-law said, "Claire, what we did, asking you to leave the way we did, I've thought about that over the years." "You don't have to," I said. "I want to," she said, and there was something in her voice that was different from anything I had ever heard from her in the 3 years I had been her son's wife. A kind of rawness that her usual composure didn't quite manage to cover. "We were grieving. We handled it very badly. That doesn't make it right. I had not planned for this part. I had planned for the negotiation, for the professional exchange, for the clean completion of a transaction I had spent 6 weeks structuring carefully. I had not planned for my former mother-in-law to look at me like that in the middle of a conference room with her hands folded on top of a financial proposal and her eyes doing something honest and unguarded. I thought about Daniel. I thought about the way he used to say that his mother was difficult, that she had loved him fiercely, and that love had made her rigid in the wrong directions at the wrong moments. He had said it without bitterness. He had said it as someone who had chosen to understand rather than to condemn. "I know you were grieving," I said. "So was I." She nodded. She pressed her lips together. The attorney was studying his own notepad with a focus that suggested he was actively choosing not to witness whatever this had become. "I'd like to get through the business," I said, "and then if you're open to it, I think there are things worth talking about. Not about the deal, just the rest of it." My former father-in-law said, "We'd like that." We finished the meeting. We went through the remaining terms, asked and answered the remaining questions, agreed on a timeline for due diligence. When their attorney shook my hand at the end and said it had been a pleasure meeting me, I thanked him, and I meant it. He had done his job cleanly and professionally and had managed to recalibrate in real time when the meeting became something other than what he had prepared for, and that was its own kind of skill. My former in-laws lingered in the lobby while their attorney collected his things. My former father-in-law said, "There's a restaurant 2 blocks from here if you have time." I did have time. I had cleared my afternoon deliberately, though I had told myself it was in case the negotiation ran long. We sat in a booth near the window and ordered coffee and were quiet for a moment in the way people are quiet when they have arrived somewhere they didn't expect to be and aren't quite sure who speaks first. He spoke first. He talked about the business, about where the decisions had gone wrong, about the specific pride that had kept him from restructuring sooner because restructuring felt like admitting failure, and how by the time he acknowledged the problem the options had narrowed considerably. It was a more honest accounting than I would have expected from him. I listened without comment till he was done. Then he said, "We should have handled Daniel's death differently, in terms of how we treated you." I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and thought about how to say what I wanted to say in a way that was true and also complete. "Daniel loved you both," I said. "He told me once that you were hard on him because you were afraid, that you pushed because you wanted him to be protected from things that had hurt you." He didn't say it as a criticism. He said it like someone trying to explain something complicated in the most charitable way he could. My former mother-in-law's eyes filled. She blinked, controlled it, the way she had probably controlled things her whole life, and said, "That sounds like him." "It was very like him," I said. We sat for another hour. Not everything got said. Some of the weight between us was too old and too layered to be resolved over coffee in a restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon. But something shifted. Not dramatically, not cinematic ally, just the quiet way something shifts when people decide to be honest with each other instead of performing the versions of themselves that are easier to wear. When we stood to leave, my former mother-in-law paused on the sidewalk outside and said, "I'd like to stay in touch. If you'd be open to it." I thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "I'd be open to that," I said. She nodded. Her eyes were still bright, but her chin was steady. She looked like someone who had been carrying something for 11 years and had just shifted the weight slightly, not put it down entirely, but shifted it. My former father-in-law shook my hand. His grip was firm. "Daniel would have been proud of you," he said. "I hope you know that." "I do," I said. "I've always known that." I drove to the cemetery on the way back to my office. It was not something I had planned, but I found myself turning in that direction without deciding to, the way you sometimes move towards something before your thinking has quite caught up with your instinct. I stood at Daniel's headstone for a while. The afternoon light was low and thin through the November trees, and the cemetery was quiet in that specific way of late autumn. Not sad, exactly, but serious. The way places are serious when they hold things that matter. I told him, more or less, what had happened. I told him his mother had cried in a conference room in downtown Wilmington and that his father had admitted he was wrong and that they were both older and smaller and more human than I had kept them in my memory. I told him I thought the meeting had gone well, by most measures. I told him I missed him, which was the truest thing and the thing I always said last. The drive back to my office took 20 minutes. I sat at my desk and answered 3 emails and reviewed a lease amendment and at some point poured a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it. My assistant knocked on the door just before 5 and said I had a call from my financing partner about the final term sheet. I picked up the phone and I worked, and the afternoon moved through its last hours, and outside my window the city went about its business in the ordinary, irreplaceable way that cities do when they don't know they're carrying the weight of something significant. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated exactly. I felt something quieter and more durable, like a door I had kept locked for 11 years had been opened, not broken open, not flung wide, just opened, calmly, by someone who had finally found the right key and decided, in her own time, that she was ready to walk through it. I thought about Mr. Creers, Caldwell. I picked up my phone and sent him a message that said simply, "It went well. Thank you for the casserole 11 years ago." He replied 8 minutes later with, "I knew it would." Daniel knew it too. I set my phone face down on the desk and sat for a moment in the quiet of my office, which had my name on the door and the photograph of Daniel on the corner of the desk and a view of a city I had learned, slowly and on my own terms, to call home. Outside, November light was failing over the water. Somewhere, my former in-laws were driving back to a house that was about to become part of something new. Somewhere, Mr. Caldwell was sitting in a chair in Savannah, content with how things had turned out, and I was here, with the work still in front of me and the past settled behind me into something I could carry without it breaking anything, and the particular, hard-won quiet of someone who had long ago stopped waiting for the world to offer her a fair start, and had simply decided, in the absence of one, to build her own.